Boa noite a todos. É uma honra imensa estar hoje fazendo a abertura desse nosso 11º Encontro Internacional da Associação Nacional de Professores e Pesquisadores de História das Américas, ANPHLAC. Eu tive a sorte de estar em Mariana, em 1992, no nosso primeiro encontro. Eu era recém-ingressa na universidade, tinha meses, né, que eu tinha ingressado, e foi meu primeiro evento representando a área de História das Américas, da UF. Eu fui com professores mais antigos, o professor Ronaldo Vanfas e a minha querida e saudosa amiga Maria de Fátima Gouveia. E a ANPHLAC se resumia a uma mesa, não é? Onde cabiam talvez 20 pessoas, professores de vários estados, dirigidos pela professora Maria Lígia Prado e a professora Maria Helena Capelato. E eu não podia imaginar que estava presenciando um momento decisivo, marcante para a história, né, dos estudos de História das Américas no nosso país. E eu não poderia imaginar também que a ANPHLAC fosse se tornar a minha casa, não apenas a minha casa, mas a minha comunidade afetiva. E nessa abertura hoje, eu fiquei pensando no quanto eu devo, não é, a todos vocês que estão aqui na minha frente, meus queridos amigos, colegas, parceiros na aventura da pós-graduação, da formação, que estiveram ao meu lado, minhas professoras queridas, e o quanto a minha história, de alguma forma, se confunde com a da ANPHLAC, porque eu estou prestes a me aposentar mês que vem, e agora estou aqui nessa mesa, isso me dá uma imensa alegria, né, e um imenso orgulho. E, na verdade, também, não é, essa responsabilidade, esse orgulho é muito maior, porque eu recebi essa missão das mãos das duas pessoas mais importantes dessa associação, a minha querida, inspiradora, ex-orientadora, Maria Helena Capelato e Maria Lígia Prado. E certamente não era uma missão muito fácil de assumir, muito desafiadora, mas também muito honrosa, não é? Mas, felizmente, eu nunca estive só, ninguém faz um evento como esse sozinho, né? Felizmente, eu tive a ajuda de todos os meus colegas. Na verdade, essa universidade foi muito solidária, não é, em todos os momentos, mas eu estou aqui representando, em primeiro lugar, a diretoria da ANPHLAC, eu estou representando o conselho científico do evento, na comissão organizadora, e estou representando também meus colegas, professores de História da América da UF. Nós todos, na verdade, estamos aqui juntos, não é? Esse é um evento de todos nós, que pensamos, refletimos e discutimos juntos. Eu recebi de todos eles uma ajuda inestimável, não é? Meus colegas também do núcleo a qual eu pertenço, Núcleo de Estudos de História Cultural, meus colegas do Laboratório de História Oral e Imagem, meus colegas do Propietas, de todos os laboratórios que me ajudaram imensamente, né? Eu quero registrar especialmente o apoio incondicional que eu recebi da Pró-Reitoria de Pós-Graduação e Pesquisa, primeiro na pessoa do professor Antônio Nóbrega e, posteriormente, na pessoa da professora Andréa Latiger, que não pouparam esforços e sempre acreditaram desde o princípio no nosso projeto e foram responsáveis pela vinda dos nossos conferencistas estrangeiros, não é? Sem a ajuda da PROP, nós não poderíamos ter realizado esse evento conforme nós realizamos, e eu queria registrar publicamente o meu imenso agradecimento. Vocês me salvaram em todas as emergências, ajudaram a apagar incêndios, então eu quero agradecer imensamente. Eu quero agradecer também ao pessoal do STI, que está aí fazendo a filmagem, o pessoal da UniTV, todos esses núcleos da UF foram fundamentais, juntar os esforços de todos eles para que esse evento ocorresse. Mas esse evento também, ele transcende essa universidade. Eu não tenho como agradecer também a Universidade Federal do Rio de Janeiro, na pessoa da minha amiga, companheira, Juliana Beatriz, que não poupou esforços para recrutar alunos, monitores, bolsistas, recursos materiais, e dividiu comigo não só todas as tarefas, as decisões, mas principalmente as indecisões, as aflições, e sem ela seria impossível. Ela não é apenas uma colega, mas ela tem sido minha irmã dedicada. A ela não tenho como agradecer devidamente. Quero agradecer, então, ao Instituto de História, da Universidade Federal do Rio de Janeiro. O professor Fábio Lessa está aqui, eu queria também agradecer a ele. Eu quero agradecer também imensamente a minha colega Samantha Quadrá, que está aqui representando a pós-graduação em História da UF, e ao Departamento de História da UF, ao Instituto de Ciências Humanas também, todas essas instâncias nos apoiaram, e eu estou imensamente feliz por isso. Quero agradecer também, é uma lista longa de agradecimentos, eu quero agradecer também, claro, ao Museu do Ingá, que está nos abrigando nesta noite, está sendo tão generosa a direção dessa casa, então eu quero agradecer imensamente. Como também quero agradecer a Fundação de Artes de Niterói, na pessoa do professor André Diniz, que, felizmente, é um ex-aluno nosso, e nós batemos as portas dele e pedimos que ele ajudasse as velhas professoras a organizar um evento, e ele foi muito solícito, generoso, e nos permitiu realizar outras atividades no Solar do Jambeiro e no Caminho Niemeyer, no Teatro Popular Oscar Niemeyer. E eu fiquei muito feliz por isso, porque eu acho que é uma forma também de propiciar aos participantes desse evento um contato com o roteiro cultural dessa cidade que é tão bela, Niterói, tão acolhedora, mas, além da beleza natural, também dispõe de um circuito cultural, histórico e um conjunto arquitetônico do nosso Oscar Niemeyer, belíssimo. Então, eu convido a vocês que não percam o lançamento de livros no Solar do Jambeiro, onde também vamos ter uma apresentação de um grupo, de um programa social de músicos, sustentado pela UF, e que vai se apresentar lá também, além dos lançamentos. E a festa final, de frente para a Bahia, no Teatro Oscar Niemeyer. Eu, evidentemente, quero agradecer imensamente ao Consulado dos Estados Unidos, na pessoa do Sr. John Creamer e Mark Stroll, também, por ter, e a Leila Santos, por ter me ajudado tanto nesse processo. Eu bati as portas deles, pedindo ajuda para a tradução simultânea, porque seria muito lamentável que as palavras do professor Gary Gerstle não fossem compreendidas por todos. E, graças ao consulado, nós temos aqui a tradução simultânea. Eu quero agradecer, enfim, a todos os participantes, aos nossos convidados que vieram de fora, e tiveram muitos imprevistos ao longo da viagem. e aos professores estrangeiros, e também aos colegas, alunos que vieram de fora do Estado do Rio e de fora do Sudeste. A gente vê com muita alegria que a ANPHLAC cresceu não apenas numericamente, em termos de associados e inscritos, mas ela se nacionalizou. E isso nos deixa muito felizes, porque comprova que os investimentos que a gente fez na pesquisa, no ensino de História das Américas, está frutificando, né? Então, nós temos várias gerações nesse evento, e isso é algo para celebrarmos, não é? Quero agradecer imensamente ao professor Gary Gerstle, que, em meio a problemas de ordem pessoal, o professor está fazendo uma mudança imensa, uma mudança que não é muito complexa. Ele está mudando para o outro lado do Atlântico, e, apesar disso, ele manteve sua disposição em vir aqui. E, mais do que isso, ele generosamente vai partilhar conosco reflexões que são inéditas ainda, que ele ainda vai publicar no próximo livro dele, em 2015. Né? Então, é um privilégio nós termos acesso, né, a esse seu trabalho. Nós não temos como agradecer essa delicadeza, essa sua bondade. E também eu quero dizer que o professor Gary Gerstle é conhecido dos nossos alunos, em primeiro lugar, porque, felizmente, nós temos uma tradução para o português de um dos seus artigos, que foi publicado na revista Tempo, né, da UF, há alguns anos atrás. E aí, felizmente, nós podemos usar seu texto em português na graduação, mas ele também é muito conhecido dos nossos alunos de pós-graduação, todos os outros seus textos que são imprescindíveis para quem quer conhecer a história dos Estados Unidos. Então, eu quero agradecer muitíssimo a sua presença aqui hoje, e quero também dizer que eu vou deixar o cônsul John Creamer destacar, não é, a sua trajetória, as suas principais obras, não é? Eu vou deixar para ele essa tarefa. E quero, então, agradecer a presença de todos aqui nessa noite, e me colocar à disposição para qualquer problema que haja. A gente sabe que as imperfeições são muitas, mas a vontade de acertar a gente tem, e eu quero me colocar à disposição para corrigir os problemas que, porventura, vocês observem. Não é? Desejar, então, vida longa à nossa associação tão querida, a ANPHLAC. Muito obrigada.
E agora ouviremos a professora da UFRJ, doutora Juliana Beatriz de Almeida de Souza.
Bom, boa noite a todos. Serei bastante breve, mas queria compartilhar com a Cecília a imensa alegria que é estar aqui hoje, fazendo parte da diretoria da ANPHLAC, de maneira não igual, mas de maneira parecida. Eu vi a ANPHLAC também dos seus inícios, em 92, eu ainda era aluna de graduação, mas a ANPHLAC também faz parte da minha vida desde então. Então, é com muita alegria e com muita honra que eu estou aqui hoje, e quero, então, desejar que tenhamos um bom encontro, que as mesas, que os momentos que a gente possa estar junto e trocando experiências e os nossos conhecimentos e trabalhos, que esse encontro possa, portanto, ser bastante frutífero, como foram todos os outros, né? E que a gente possa também partilhar a alegria de estarmos juntos. Então, queria agradecer a todos a presença, a confiança, e desejar a todos um bom encontro, e que sejam todos bem-vindos à ANPHLAC e à cidade de Niterói.
Ouviremos a vice-coordenadora da pós-graduação em História, professora Samantha Vice-Quadrato.
Bom, também serei breve. Boa noite a todos. Quero dar as boas-vindas a todos vocês, em nome da área de História, né, em nome especialmente da pós-graduação, meu e da Ana Mauad, que é a coordenadora. dar parabéns aos colegas pela organização. Eu tenho certeza que será um evento excelente, como costuma ser todos os eventos da ANPHLAC, com diferencial de Niterói, que a Cecília já destacou. E quero também registrar minha alegria. Eu estava entrando na UF em 92 como aluna, sonhando em estudar História Antiga. Fiz esse salto, né, para a história do tempo presente, muito graças à equipe que também chegava, né, a Cecília, a Marta e tantos outros professores com quem eu tive o prazer de gostar de História da América, né, era 92, o ano também dos 500 anos, com muitos seminários, muitos livros sendo publicados, né, então aquela euforia também me pegou ali, né, nomes consagrados como Ciro Cardoso, Ronaldo Vanfas, publicando, né, fui aluna da Raquel Soyer, e a presença da chegada, né, de Regina, Marta, Fátima, Cecília, a quem eu sou muito grata, porque me fizeram, né, gostar de História da América, no momento em que eu nem sonhava em ser professora da UF, meu sonho era ser professora de História. Então, eu registro aqui meus agradecimentos e dou também as boas-vindas a todos. Né, e dizer que a pós está aberta, por acaso, qualquer emergência, o que não vai acontecer, mas para o que vocês precisarem, é só procurar a gente lá no final do campus, no bloco O, no 5º andar, que a gente está disponível para qualquer caso que venha a ocorrer. Tá? Bom evento para todos nós, tenho certeza que será um sucesso.
Com a palavra, a professora emérita da UF, presidente da Associação no Museu do Ingá, professora Ismênia de Lima Martins.
Bom, eu deveria, mas não vou conseguir fazer o mesmo, né? Dizer, estou muito contente, parabéns, bom congresso. Não vou conseguir. Eu quero dizer do meu entusiasmo de ter participado um pouquinho desta organização, ajudando a Cecília em alguns encontros em Niterói, com autoridades municipais, facilitando aqui no museu, né? Porque no seu projeto de recepção estava... Ismênia, eu quero mostrar para todo mundo de fora um pouco de Niterói. Aí eu achei tão bom, né? Porque eu tenho um artigo escrito mostrando todas as coisas que dizem de Niterói, né? Aquele imaginário perverso do cidade sorriso numa boca sem dentes, a cidade onde o urubu voa de costas e não sei mais o quê, né? Então, ela me disse, não, eu quero mostrar o Museu do Ingá, eu quero mostrar o Caminho Niemeyer, vamos fazer a recepção aqui e ali, tudo que era difícil, mas a gente ela conseguiu costurar tudo e esse projeto me entusiasmou sobremaneira, né? Porque, na verdade, esse museu, particularmente, talvez vários museus da rede estadual estão fechados. Aqui em Niterói mesmo, o Museu Parreiras, a Casa Museu Oliveira Viana, no Rio de Janeiro, vários outros, como o Museu da Marquesa de Santos, né? E a gente, com muita luta, consegue manter aberto este museu, que tem uma reserva técnica de uma coleção de arte contemporânea do antigo manejo importantíssimo, que ainda não tem condições de exibição, mas que está sendo mantido dentro dos padrões. Tem um setor de pesquisa importante, mantido com todo entusiasmo, com poucos recursos, mas com muita dedicação e vocação, pela professora Andréa Tello, né, que fez desse espaço um espaço supra-universitário. Praticamente todos os meses existe aqui um evento que reúne professores da Unirio, da UF, da UFRJ, da UERJ e da Rural. Isso eu acho estupendo para pensar e refletir esse espaço do Grande Rio e do antigo Estado do Rio de Janeiro. Então, eu também agora dou as boas-vindas para os outros, como todos os outros, dizendo que a Cecília é uma pessoa muito especial, né? Todos nós temos um pouco de especial por sermos professores de História, por gostarmos de História da América, etc. Mas ela tem essa maneira simples, despojada, mas persistente de resolver coisas difíceis e de não desistir. Então, eu tenho certeza que vamos ter um belo encontro e já começou com a chuva parando. Obrigada.
Com a palavra, a pró-reitora de Pesquisa, Pós-Graduação e Inovação, professora Andréa Latiger.
Bom, boa noite a todos, também vou ser bastante breve, mas eu queria deixar registrado aqui, a primeira coisa, que eu me sinto muito orgulhosa de estar aqui hoje presente nesse ambiente aqui tão diferenciado para mim. Eu deveria estar me sentindo como um peixe fora d'água, porque é a primeira vez que eu participo de um evento da área de História, e eu sou da área de Física, uma área assim, completamente, poderia, a princípio, dizer bastante diversa, né, da área humana, né? Mas, para mim, sempre foi assim, uma coisa que ficou na minha cabeça. Eu sou professora da UF já há muitos anos, há 30 anos que eu estou trabalhando na universidade, e o departamento de História, a pós-graduação de História em particular, sempre foi, assim, para nós, o exemplo que a gente queria ser quando crescesse, né? Nós temos também uma pós-graduação na física muito boa, madura, que é reconhecida nacionalmente, mas, para nós, professor da UF, a História sempre foi aquilo que a gente quer ser quando crescer. Então, eu me sinto muito orgulhosa de estar aqui nesse ambiente. Eu acho que, naturalmente, a Pró-Reitoria de Pesquisa, Pós-Graduação e Inovação não teria como não ajudar a esse evento tão importante. Eu acho que não por ser a pós-graduação da História um curso nota 7, mas por ser um curso que a gente sente professores completamente envolvidos com a missão de estar nessa universidade. Eu acho que a fala da Cecília e outras falas aqui mostram o quanto as pessoas são envolvidas nesse processo educacional, nesse processo de fazer pesquisa, e eu acho que não é à toa que eles conseguem tudo isso que tem se conseguido em termos de projeção nacional e internacional. Então, eu realmente estou muito grata de estar aqui, fico feliz de estar no ambiente de um museu. Não é sempre que a gente está no ambiente do museu, às vezes a gente faz eventos em museus de ciência, mas esse museu aqui é um museu bastante particular. Sou niteroense, também sou bem aquela coisa de adoro Niterói, que gosto de querer mostrar Niterói para as pessoas, o que ela tem do lado melhor delas. E eu realmente sei que vai ser um sucesso e espero que vocês tenham um bom encontro, retornem à UF, os alunos que não estão matriculados no curso de pós-graduação, que se matriculem na pós-graduação da UF, porque vale a pena. Tá? Um bom trabalho para todos.
E para o pronunciamento final da mesa, ouviremos o cônsul-geral dos Estados Unidos no Rio de Janeiro, o senhor John Creamer.
Senhoras e senhores, boa noite. Agradeço a todos pela presença. Gostaria de agradecer à professora Cecília Acevedo pela organização desta conferência. Gostaria também de agradecer à pró-reitora de pesquisa da UF, Andréa Latiger, e todas as pessoas que trabalharam para fazer possível este evento. Muito obrigado também aos eminentes palestrantes brasileiros e de outros países nas Américas por sua participação. Estou certo que as palestras e apresentações a serem travadas durante o encontro de hoje contribuirão de forma eloquente para uma compreensão mais aprofundada sobre a história das Américas que todos nós compartilhamos. Como um diplomata, tenho de lidar com os acontecimentos atuais, mas um diplomata que não procura entender a história dos países onde trabalha é um péssimo diplomata. Por isso, é um grande prazer estar aqui com vocês, tanto sob a perspectiva pessoal quanto a profissional. Sinto-me honrado por contar com a presença do Dr. Gary Gerstle, que irá proferir a conferência de abertura deste encontro. O professor Gary Gerstle é especialista em história dos Estados Unidos do século XX, sendo autor, coautor e co-editor de 6 livros e autor de mais de 30 artigos. Seu trabalho já foi traduzido por vários idiomas, inclusive o português. Entre suas principais áreas de interesse estão imigração, raça e nacionalidade, a importância da classe na vida social e política, e movimentos sociais, político popular e o Estado. O professor Gerstle possui doutorado da Universidade de Harvard e já recebeu várias fellowships, incluindo a John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Fellowship e o National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowship. Ele já deu em inúmeras conferências em diversos países, não só em eventos acadêmicos, mas também para o público em geral. Além disso, é frequentemente consultado por repórteres de jornais, revistas e televisão. Lecionou na Universidade de Maryland e, até recentemente, na Universidade de Vanderbilt. No momento, está de mudança para a Universidade de Cambridge, no Reino Unido. As áreas de especialização de Dr. Gerstle têm grande relevância para as discussões aqui travadas, tanto no que diz respeito ao Brasil quanto aos Estados Unidos. Agradeço à UF e à professora Cecília por sua excelente escolha. Minhas expectativas quanto a uma palestra informativa esta noite e também no que diz respeito à conferência esclarecedora no decorrer desta semana são bastante grandes. Desejo a todos um ótimo encontro. Muito obrigado.
E teremos agora a conferência Paradoxos do Poder Governamental dos Estados Unidos com o professor Gary Gerstle, da Vanderbilt University.
I will be at Vanderbilt University 2 more weeks. And then, as you've heard, I am making a big move to England. When I accepted this invitation, I had no idea this would be happening. Cecilia apologized for bringing me down here amidst all this chaos, and I want to tell her I've had more rest in the last 2 days since getting here than I've had in the last 6 weeks. It is a great privilege for me to come to Brazil, to Rio, to Niterói, and to address this convocation of historians from across the Americas. I want to thank Cecilia Acevedo for her indefatigable and creative work in making all this possible. I want to thank Cecilia and her fellow organizers for assembling such a large and interesting program. I want to thank UFI for doing so much to host the conference, and I want to say that whenever I hear this university's name among my Brazilian colleagues in the United States, their face radiates. It's a very important institution, so I'm delighted to make this connection. And I want to thank the U.S. Consulate General in Brazil, and particularly Consul General John Creamer for that wonderful introduction. Public Affairs Officer Mark Stroh. And I want to thank them not just for the introduction, but for their presence here tonight and for their support. I also want to mark this moment and the significance of this organization reaching out to North American scholars. And my understanding is that this is a rather recent development. And I want to say that the moment is opportune. There's a great interest in the United States in transnational and comparative history. U.S. historians in the United States, traditionally, historically, have been very inward-looking. It's a big country, and there have been many things to study internally. I think there's a recognition now that the United States has to understand more about its relationship to the world, both comparatively and through various kinds of relationships. And among our graduate students, there is no more popular topic than transnational history, comparative history. My point is that this is, I hope, the beginning of a time when we can improve the links across borders to encourage interchange among the scholars training in different countries in the interest, ultimately, of building better history, better understanding, better knowledge of our own societies and the relationships that tie the societies together. So I hope in the next few days, after my formal talk and remarks are over, that I will have an opportunity to talk with many of you individually, and that we can begin the process of building links, which many of us in the United States consider to be very, very important. The title of my talk is Paradoxes of State Power in the United States, and it is drawn from a book that I'm just in the process of finishing, And when Cecilia said this is new work, of which I've published very little, this is true. And it's exciting for me to share with you some of the issues that I have been thinking about for the last 5 or 6 years. If the United States has a favorite story it likes to tell about itself, it is this. The United States is a place where an individual can thrive free of limitations, where no monarch, aristocrat, or hierarchical power can tell a person what to do or how to live or how far he can rise in the social order or what name or identity he might take or whom he might marry. While this liberty is understood to oppose all forms of social and political restraint, it is thought to challenge the tyranny of governments most of all. Liberty in this United States tale flourishes the most where government is weak, or at least sharply limited in its powers and reach. This liberty-loving anti-statism took shape in the 1770s and 1780s in the course of the birth of the United States in rebellion against the England of George III. At that time, the British monarchical and imperial government came to be seen in the colonies as the chief source of hierarchy and tyranny in North America. As the colonists went about creating their own nation, they were determined to make sure that the concentration of power in government that had allegedly made possible the misrule of George III would never happen again. Practically, this determination took the form of constructing a central government whose power would be limited and fragmented. The first attempt to do so, the Articles of Confederation, yielded a central state so weak that it got blown over several times by the mildest of political winds. Thus, a constitutional convention gathered in Philadelphia in 1787 to replace this frail hut with something sturdier. Out of this came the United States Constitution, ratified and installed in 1789. Its laws and blueprints still govern the United States, making it the oldest written constitution operative in the world today. The Constitution of 1789 gave the central government substantial authority to order the economic environment in which individuals lived and to lay down laws making it possible for them to truck, barter, and trade under conditions of transparency and relative equality. It possessed the authority to raise an army and make war, lay tariffs and taxes, print money and regulate immigration and naturalization, sponsor internal improvements, supervise the mails, and acquire, control, and distribute land, including land belonging to the Indians. Still, this central authority had to operate within limits. Many matters of governance were to be left to the individual states themselves or to private individuals. Indeed, there was so much concern about protecting individuals from the government that the framers of the Constitution, upon its ratification in 1789, immediately attached 10 amendments to it, elaborating rights held by individuals that no central government in the United States would be allowed to touch. These rights included the right to speak freely, the right to have a free press, the right to assemble peacefully with no restrictions on what could be said at such meetings, the right to worship in a religion of one's choice, or not to worship at all, the right to petition the government for a redress of grievances without fear of reprisal. These amendments also set forth rights available to those who got in trouble with the law. Every individual was guaranteed a right to a fair and speedy trial by an impartial jury of his peers. No court could compel an individual to incriminate himself or herself, or impose cruel and unusual punishments, or try an individual twice for the same crime. These rights, as brought together in the first 10 amendments, came to be known as the Bill of Rights. They were celebrated then and still are today as America's Charter of Liberties, its Magna Carta. The Bill of Rights was a liberal document in the classical sense of that term, meaning that it was meant to identify a core area of human freedom, assert its inviolability, and protect it from government power and control. The appearance of the Bill of Rights in 1789 marked a major advance in the construction of liberal political theory and practice, not just in the United States, but I would argue in the world. It can be and should be regarded as one of the United States' finest achievements. But the United States has never been simply a sweet land of liberty. It has been as well a harsh land of coercion. Slavery flourished in this land from the 1780s through the 1860s. After Abraham Lincoln and the armies of the North destroyed slavery in the 1860s, the United States continued for another 100 years to tolerate the regular and systematic violation of all kinds of basic liberties, including those allegedly protected by the Bill of Rights. Legal codes denied citizens who were African American access to residential areas, jobs, parks, restaurants, and toilets marked as white. Other laws denied East Asian immigrants the right to own land. People of all colors, black, brown, yellow, and white, were denied the right to drink alcohol in many cities and counties across the country. For 14 amazing years, 1920 to 1933, the entire country banned the manufacture and sale of alcohol. Countless laws regulated sexual behavior, forbade homosexual sex and many forms of contraception, and outlawed all kinds of literature, including James Joyce's Ulysses, judged to be obscene. As many as half the states in the United States forbade marriage across the color line. So-called blue laws ordered the closing of all stores and the shutting down of all commerce on the Sabbath. One can find numerous instances of these laws throughout 19th century America and through the first half of the 20th century. In other words, for 3/4 of its history, the United States was a deeply regulated society. In fact, one can argue that the United States during these 170 years sustained some of the most intrusive regimes of sexual, moral, and racial regulation in the world. Hence the apparent paradox. How could a society be so liberal and illiberal at the same time? How could it be home to the Bill of Rights on the one hand and to slavery, racial apartheid, and prohibition on the other? Were I giving this lecture some decades ago, not that old, I would probably try to answer this paradox by identifying two American minds or worldviews jostling each other for primacy. One liberty-loving, perhaps emerging from the mid-Atlantic states, where commerce, trade, diversity, and personal liberty triumphed over all. We might call this the commercial cosmopolitan spirit of New York City. The other American mind would have been the repressive one, associated with those narrow-minded, bigoted religious zealots from England who, finding life in that beloved island nation of theirs intolerably sinful, set sail for the New World in 1627 to build a new England and to make it a society of saints. We might call this mind the puritanical spirit of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. It is these Puritans of Massachusetts, by the way, whom Americans celebrate every year in November with a 4-day festival of food, family, and football, that is American football, that they, or rather we, call Thanksgiving. I doubt that those original Puritans would have approved of such carrying on. They would have hated Carnival. For them, even Christmas was a day of work. But this is not the 1950s, and you will not hear from me today a lecture on the two minds or cultures, as entertaining as it might be. Rather, I wish to focus less on the origins of particular attitudes and orientations, and more on their perpetuation across 200 to 300 years of American history. The key to their perpetuation, I want to argue, is a way in which these contrasting dispositions got sedimented into governing institutions and into theories of governance and into law. They became embedded in its institutional and political structures independent of the original cultural, political, or social disposition that caused them to arise in the first place. My lecture today is an argument, then, about the power of institutions. I wish to direct your attention to the governing system set up by the Constitution of 1789 and to one of its features, what I would call its core feature in particular, its federal character. The United States divided authority between the central government and the governments of its constituent parts, the 13 states. This division was central to the overriding ambition to prevent any one institution of government from gaining too much power. But America's federal system went beyond a simple division of powers. It organized the two major divisions of government, the central government and the states, around different theories of power. A liberal theory animated and guided the central government, The fundamental principle of this liberal theory was that citizens had fundamental rights that no government could take away except under the most extraordinary of circumstances. The individual states, Virginia, New York, Massachusetts, South Carolina, and 9 others at the moment of the country's creation, did not operate according to this liberal principle. Their principle of governance was one that held the public good in higher esteem than private right. It called for a polity well regulated by government, in which no individual right, written or unwritten, natural or absolute, could be permitted to trump the people's safety or welfare. It closely resembled what scholars of the mid and late 20th century, I have in mind figures such as J.C.A. Pocock, Gordon Wood, Quentin Skinner, Maurizio Veroli, Hilda Sabato, have called the ideology of republicanism. Like republicanism, this principle of governance put its faith in the ability of responsible, virtuous citizens to determine and agree on the public interest, or salus populi, the people's welfare. This principle of government was not indifferent to individual rights, but it insisted that the enjoyment of personal freedom and individual rights depended on the carefully regulated society that government would construct. This Republican principle of governance endowed the states with a scope of authority more capacious than that which inhered in the central government itself. In truth, state governments possessed a staggering freedom of action. They had the power to direct internal transportation improvements, issue controls on capital and labor, build schools, libraries, and other educational facilities, engage in town planning, and supervise public health. They organized moral life, not just in terms of rules governing marriage, which the states exclusively controlled, but in terms of rules regulating all kinds of behavior: drinking, narcotics, gambling, theater going and the arts, sexuality, and a community's disposition to the migrant poor were all subject to the control of the states. The states could deploy their powers progressively, as, for example, in insisting that capitalist development be subjected to the people's welfare, and they could deploy them regressively, as, for example, in legislating hierarchies grounded in race or sex into law. The vast majority of laws legitimating slavery from 1789 to 1863 were state laws. So too, after the Civil War, were the laws buttressing Americans' system of racial apartheid, a system formally installed in the 1890s and that governed all the states of the American South until the middle decades of the 20th century. Americans like to celebrate the brilliance of their founding fathers, but in truth, it must be said that the different theories of governance that came to animate different levels of government did not result from a grand or brilliant design. There was, to be sure, an element of design apparent in the 10th Amendment, the last of the Bill of Rights, which stated, and I quote, "The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved for the states respectively or to the people." Through this 10th Amendment, state governments acquired what legal scholars would later call the residual power of government. There was nothing at all residual about this power, however. The very refusal to name the powers of state governments, America's jurists would soon argue, meant that the potential power to be exercised by these state institutions was great. But if part of the system emerged by design, other parts resulted from messy circumstances on the one hand, and what we might call, or what I'm calling, the Tocquevillian law of revolution on the other. The messy circumstances arose from the reluctance of the former British colonies, now coming together to form the United States, to subsume themselves under a new central authority. They had not liked their previous central authority, George III, and powerful groups within each colony come state worried that there were those in the new republic who wanted to erect another authority like it. Moreover, most of these colonies had developed robust sets of governing institutions across the long period during which they had been under British rule, and many of the leaders of these colonies had come to believe that the very robustness of these institutions gave them a claim on sovereignty. Colonial governing institutions had never been sovereign, of course. That is why the U.S. War of Independence had broken out in the first place. But the very war for independence had, at the very least, raised the possibility that Virginia, New York, Pennsylvania, and South Carolina, among others, could become their own fully independent entities, much as Mexico, Colombia, Bolivia, Peru, Chile, and Argentina would become fully independent entities as a result of their struggles against Spain. The rebels in the North American colonies knew, of course, at some level that they needed each other. No struggle against Britain would have succeeded without such intercolonial cooperation. But lateral relations among the colonies were historically weak. British rule had bound each colony to the metropole far more strongly than it had bound the colonies to each other. And within each former colony in the 1780s and 1790s, there was strong support for the notion that each should keep as much of its autonomy, as much of its sovereignty as it could. This aspiration towards sovereignty congealed in the ideology of states' rights and around the principle of secession. If the central government does something we don't like, we will leave the Federation. If we substitute Brussels for central government, imagine the we as Great Britain and the Federation as the European Union, well then we might say that America's 1780s moment was rather similar to Europe's messy situation today. In both cases, multiple political entities recognized the need for a stronger political and economic union, even as they were loath to give up any power that could be perceived as injuring their sovereignty. In the United States in the 1780s and 1790s, this tension gave rise to a system of rule that reserved as much power for the states and gave as little to the central government as was functionally possible. To reiterate my point about the United States, the system of rule resulted not so much from a grand theory of politics as it did from the instinctive effort of semi-sovereign entities with long and independent histories to maintain their autonomy. What would the content of power being reserved for the states actually look like? Here's where what I'm calling the Tocquevillian law of revolution comes into play. Tocqueville's law of revolution is actually a law about the difficulty of effectuating revolution, of successfully turning the world as one knows it upside down. Tocqueville argued that even the most revolutionary societies, such as his own France of the 1790s, had great difficulty starting everything anew. The pre-revolutionary order, the ancien régime, therefore necessarily came to play a far more important role in the new revolutionary society than anyone could have imagined it would. In France's case, Tocqueville argued, the heavy centralization so characteristic of French absolutism immediately and profoundly came to characterize the French revolutionary state. Some might say it still does. In the case of the United States, I want to argue a body of public law that had deeply shaped law and governance in early modern England and the colonies came to characterize law and governance in the new American Republic. One can see this continuity particularly clearly in the doctrine of the police that had once been rooted in the king's prerogative and that had worked its way into multiple colonial charters. Even as the king's authority was repudiated amidst the embrace of republicanism in the 1770s and 1780s, this pre-revolutionary police doctrine gained new life in the laws of the American states. This 18th century police doctrine embodied a breadth of activity that exceeds our modern common sense notion of what it is police do. It certainly entailed the customary tasks that we associate with policing, the protection of life, property, and public order. But in its 18th and early 19th century version, it embodied much more. In the words of 19th century Massachusetts Supreme Court Chief Justice Lemuel Shaw, police power, as it came to be known in the United States, was the power vested in the state legislature to make, ordain, and establish all manner of wholesome and reasonable laws, statutes, and ordinances as they shall judge to be for the good and welfare of the Commonwealth. The crucial phrase in Shaw's definition is the last, for the good and welfare of the Commonwealth. The welfare of the Commonwealth allowed state governments under the police power doctrine not only to act on problems that posed an immediate and physical hazard to the community, say a cow carcass rotting in the street that had to be removed, or a ship full of diseased sailors that needed to be quarantined. It also allowed state governments to act against anybody or any institution thought to offend public order or comity as determined by democratic majorities. This police power doctrine allowed state governments to engage in broad regulation of the economy, society, and morality in both progressive and regressive fashions. It underwrote a theory of governance that was collectivist and majoritarian rather than liberal. Neither the provenance nor the practice of this theory is something that we would recognize as liberal. In this theory, liberal notions of individual rights played only a secondary role. This was America's second theory of governance, one to which I have affixed the label Republican. But one could just as easily call it a theory without a name. It lacked a name because it emerged less from a grand design or from a grand theory than from the messiness of the historical circumstances surrounding America's political revolution. And it came to be lodged principally not in the central government, but in the governments of the states. So you may be wondering, and if you're not, then wonder now along with me. What happened when the illiberal doctrine of governance present in the states came up against the liberal doctrine that animated the central government as defined in the Bill of Rights? To answer this question, let me set a historical scenario for you. This is an invented scenario with a fictional protagonist, but both the scene and the protagonist are plausible as historical recreations. The story, I must note, was first fashioned by the distinguished political historian William Leuchtenberg as a pedagogical device. So if you're wondering about my fiction, I have Professor Leuchtenberg to back me up. Imagine that you are a newspaper editor, a white newspaper editor, at a North Carolina newspaper in 1859. The state of North Carolina, which is a slave state, or was a slave state, is getting testy about all the abolitionist print literature pouring in from the North, assailing the institution of slavery and the laws of North Carolina and other southern states that protected it. And so the state legislature of North Carolina passes a law declaring that any criticism of the state government is a capital offense. The law is targeted at the northern newspapers and periodicals flooding into the state. But the law is not carefully enough worded to prevent it from being applied to newspaper editors and writers living and working within the state. You, our newspaper editor, proud son of North Carolina, proud Tar Heel, do not believe that the abolition of slavery would be a good thing. But you are fiercely devoted to the freedom of the press, and you want to protect your right to criticize the government of North Carolina on issues that matter. And so you write an editorial critical of this repressive law and publish it in your newspaper. You are promptly hauled off to jail to await trial for your crime. And North Carolina in 1859, let us say, invokes the death penalty for this offense. So, what protections do you have, dear newspaper editor living in North Carolina in 1859 under the laws of the Constitution? Well, surely the First Amendment will protect you, freedom of speech and freedom of the press. No, it won't. Surely the Fifth Amendment, no punishment without due process, will protect you. No, it won't. The Sixth Amendment, right to a speedy and fair trial? Nope. The answer is no in each case because the Bill of Rights applied only to actions that the federal government took against individuals, not against the actions that states took against individuals. Here is the precise wording of the famous First Amendment of the Bill of Rights. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. This amendment, the Supreme Court of the United States had declared long before 1859, applied only to what Congress could and could not do. Congress could pass no law abridging freedom of speech, But the First Amendment said nothing about what the state legislature of North Carolina could do or not do in this regard. If North Carolina wanted to pass a law abridging the freedom of the press, it could. It could also choose to pass its own mini Bill of Rights, thereby enshrining freedom of speech and press in the state, or it could choose not to. Whatever law it chose would take precedence over the freedom supposedly guaranteed by the National Bill of Rights. Our North Carolina editor in 1859, I would say, was in a heap of trouble. Did he hang or not? I'm not going to say. Invite me back to Brazil next week to give a second lecture, and I will give you the answer. When I began my work on the American state 5 or 6 years ago, I was not thinking about its hemispheric implications. I was not thinking about today, in other words. But this work does have implications for how we think about the history of the United States in relationship to the history of Spanish and Portuguese America. The tale of liberty that I described for you at the beginning of my lecture this evening is, among other things, a story about the exceptional nature of the United States. Usually, North Americans think of their exceptionalism in relationship to Europe and to the old, stratified, stultified, and warmongering societies that allegedly dominated that continent in the 18th and 19th centuries. But a strain of this exceptionalism posits the superiority of the United States relative not to Europe, but to other new nations of the Americas. The United States, alone among the New World nations in this tale of exceptionalism, was able to realize the full promise of its revolution. It alone achieved full liberty for its people. Its democracy was the only one in the hemisphere that worked over the long term, its constitution the only one to endure. Only in the United States did the revolutionaries obliterate the old regime. In my retelling of U.S. history, however, and the central point that I am making in my lecture today, is that the revolutionaries in North America of the 18th century did not, in fact, obliterate the old regime. To the contrary, parts of the old regime survived and became embedded in the law and the constitutions of the individual states. And thus, the United States should be seen in terms that students of political history in Latin America will recognize as familiar, as a nation struggling to realize the promise of revolution and the ideals it put forward against powerful and pre-revolutionary forces of reaction. Sometimes the United States succeeded in its struggle, at other times it succumbed to the forces of the old regime. To see the United States in this way is not to argue that the United States was identical to Latin American nations, and indeed the Latin American nations were not identical to each other. Old regimes took different forms in different places. But the United States did have an old regime that not only survived the revolution, but influenced the laws and thus the politics of the states of the new republic. To make this argument calls on us to challenge the exceptionalist renderings of the United States history. It calls on us to put this country to the north in its proper hemispheric context. It suggests that there is still much to be learned from work that compares the internal political histories of New World nations. If I were giving this lecture in the United States, and if you were a group of North American historians, you would probably concede my point about the survival of the old regime along with slavery through the first 7 decades of this new republic. But you would also insist that the Civil War in the United States, fought between 1861 and 1865, changed all that. Indeed, most historians of the United States argue that the U.S. Civil War, one of the bloodiest wars the hemisphere has ever witnessed, marked an important transition in the history of governance in America, with the victory of the North ensuring both the triumph of central over state authority and the transformation in conceptions of the scope and uses of central government power. The 13th and 14th Amendments to the Constitution directly challenged prevailing conceptions of states' rights, not only by rendering all state laws protecting slavery unconstitutional, but also by transferring the power to grant citizenship and enforce its rights from the states to the central government. This growth in central government power, it has often been argued, carried over into the post-war. In some areas, it undoubtedly did, especially in terms of the central government's ability to promote capitalist development free of intrusions by the states. But in other important areas of life, the shift in power from the states to the central government set in motion by the Civil War did not last long. Indeed, by the 1870s and 1880s, states' rights were resurging across a broad front. Even though Supreme Court justices thought to be the architects of central state authority defended the police powers of the states in remarkably generous terms. One of these key architects, Associate Justice Stephen Field, argued this in 1885. Neither the 14th Amendment, broad and comprehensive as it may be, nor any other amendment was designed to interfere with the power of the state, sometimes called its police power, to prescribe regulations to promote the health, peace, morals, education, and good order of the people, and to legislate so as to increase the industries of the state, develop its resources, and add to its wealth and prosperity. The court's decision to restore considerable power to the states helps us to understand what we have long known, yet have had difficulty assimilating to our analysis of the history of government power in the United States. The explosion in the late 19th century of state legislation regulating morality, race, and sexuality in a society supposedly consecrated to laissez-faire and individual freedom. To illustrate this point, let me direct your attention for a few moments to the subject of interracial marriage. The regulation of marriage had always been regarded as lying within the authority of the states. In the early to mid-19th century, movements arose to enhance the freedom of individuals to choose their marriage partners, which meant treating marriage as a contract freely undertaken by two individuals and not as a civic act in which the government, on behalf of the people of that state, took an interest. This tendency marked the increasing sway of liberal Bill of Rights principles in personal life. But a reaction against this liberal approach gathered force in the last third of the 19th century amidst growing fears that emancipation, urbanization, and immigration were creating general social disorder, too many worrisome sexual and marital unions, and too many mixed blood offspring. Nowhere was this reaction more apparent than in the strengthening of state laws outlawing interracial marriage. These laws were not new in the second half of the 19th century, as colonial and state governments had been attempting to regulate interracial unions almost from the first time that African slaves first had been brought to North American shores. Emancipation and Reconstruction had temporarily created a more favorable climate for legalizing interracial romance and marriage. But by 1882, the U.S. Supreme Court declared that, quote, the highest interests of society and government permitted a state to exercise its police power to regulate both sexuality and marriage and race as it saw fit. With this sanction from on high, more than 20 states and territories between the 1880s and 1920s strengthened their bans on interracial sex and marriage or added new ones. The most comprehensive and repressive such law came in 1924 in Virginia, a statute that one historian has labeled the most draconian anti-miscegenation law in American history. These laws appeared not only in southern states, but in northern and western ones as well, meaning that elements of the segregationist order should be seen as national and not simply as sectional. Many states extended the prohibition on intermarriage from whites and blacks to whites and Asians and whites and Native Americans. This is what the 1924 Virginia law had done. The Supreme Court showed a similar deference to state police powers in the case of the First Amendment and its guarantees regarding freedom of speech. The federal government could not curtail this freedom except in the most extreme and temporary of circumstances, usually as defined by war. But states could, and when they did, the Supreme Court did not object. Indeed, and rather remarkably, even into the early 20th century, the Supreme Court did not perceive free expression to be an aspect of liberty, Thus, in 1907, a large Supreme Court majority voted to uphold the conviction of a newspaper editor in Denver, Colorado, who had been convicted of contempt in state court for his editorials criticizing the rulings of Colorado's state courts. What actually happened in Colorado in 1907 was remarkably similar to the fictional story I told you earlier about the fate of our 1859 newspaper editor in North Carolina. Only in the 1920s did the Supreme Court begin to get serious about drawing limits on the interference by state governments with the rights of American citizens to free speech and to carve out a sphere of private life that no government could touch. Every individual should have the right, the court declared in a decision it rendered in 1923, quote, to contract, to engage in any of the common occupations of life, to acquire useful knowledge, to marry, to establish a home and bring up children, and to worship God according to the dictates of his own conscience. In 1925, the court declared that freedom of speech and of the press, which are protected by the First Amendment from abridgment by Congress, are among the fundamental personal rights and liberties protected by the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment from impairment by the states. These were important statements, indicative that change was underway. But it would take another 40 years, from the 1920s to the 1960s, for the Supreme Court to make the other personal freedoms guaranteed and implied by the Bill of Rights the law of the land. Not until the 1960s did adults gain the right to marry individuals of their own choosing, regardless of their race. Not until the 1960s were women able to gain control of their own bodies and gain access to contraception. Not until the 1960s did the vaunted freedom of religion clause in the Bill of Rights become operative in America's public schools. Until that time, Americans remained subject to the police power doctrine of the states. They remained subject to that police power, in other words, for 100 years after the Civil War's conclusion. The struggles in the 1960s to diminish and then vanquish the police powers of the states were epic, and they still reverberate through American society. But what impresses one about this history, or what impresses me, is how long it took to create a sphere of inviolate rights and autonomy, and how resistant state governments and the federal courts long were to its claims. It took the Supreme Court 142 years, 1789 to 1931, after the ratification of the Constitution, to put its full power behind what were arguably the two most important rights in the Bill of Rights, freedom of speech and freedom of the press. And it took this same court 178 years, 1789 to 1967, to declare that individuals could not be barred for reasons of race from marrying individuals of their own choosing. Scholars have tended to be blasé about how long it took to make the Bill of Rights the law of the land. Even the historian, the distinguished historian Leuchtenberg, who has written incisively about civil liberties, refers to the freedom secured for individual Americans in the 1960s as America's second Bill of Rights. No, this 1960s moment was not about a second Bill of Rights. Rather, this moment was about securing America's first Bill of Rights, more than 170 years after it had supposedly become the law of the land. Possessing inalienable rights was supposed to mean that no government could take those rights away. But under the police power doctrine, it turns out, state governments could regulate, even obliterate many of these rights for much of American history, from the beginning of the nation until the eve of its bicentennial. The liberal doctrine of governance enshrined in the National Bill of Rights eventually did vanquish the illiberal doctrine that animated politics in the states. But until that moment of conquest, America was neither liberal or illiberal. Rather, and paradoxically, it was both a polity that promised great freedom, but that also encased that freedom in thickets of community regulations and controls. The breaking of the power of the states in the 1960s was part of a vast overhaul of America's governing structures. This overhaul saw not only the diminution of the power of the states, but the enhancement of the power of the central government. This transformation began in the 1930s and crested in the 1960s and 70s. It occurred as the United States struggled to cope with three wrenching experiences that came in quick succession: the Great Depression of the 1930s, the Civil Rights Movement of the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, and a condition of permanent war that began for the United States in 1941 and that would last half a century. These three experiences in combination overwhelmed the existing structures of governance and called forth innovation. This period of change witnessed the emergence of America's national security state with its permanently mobilized military, as well as what we might call its national welfare state. To do full justice to this transformation, which is the subject of the second half of my book, would take another whole lecture or two. Mercifully, this is not the time to embark on that. But let me say a few words about one part of this transformation: the role of war in strengthening the central government and in giving it the confidence and resources to take on the states and to make the Bill of Rights the law of the land. War was nothing new in the experience of the United States. To the contrary, since the days of Andrew Jackson, the United States had shown itself to be skilled at mobilizing sufficient resources and powers for the wars it had committed itself to fighting. After wars ended, the federal government showed an equal determination to reduce the size of its military and those civilian agencies established to support it, to stuff the central state, as it were, back into its classically liberal box. But from 1946 on, the United States was engaged in a war, the Cold War, that had no foreseeable end. The war with communism, it was thought, would be a permanent war, for which the United States developed a military establishment, a military-industrial complex, and a level of taxation that far exceeded anything in its history. The Cold War also generated what some have called the imperial presidency, an office with a dramatically enlarged sense of executive power, power that could be and was deployed across a broad terrain and often with little restraint, both within the United States and beyond its borders. The central state from the 1940s onward, in other words, became something of a leviathan. It was this central state that in the 1960s had the confidence to take on and vanquish the states and their illiberalism and to enshrine the Bill of Rights as a hallmark of American political life. Here, however, we confront a new dilemma regarding state power in America. Could a national security state be vigilant about respecting the civil liberties of its people over the long term? The Constitution had always permitted the central state to suspend limitations on its power during times of war. The expectation was that wars would be relatively brief, with clearly defined beginnings and ends, and that whatever emergency power was ceded to the central government during times of war could be clawed back after the war's conclusion. This system worked reasonably well for 3/4 of U.S. history, but it no longer does. The permanent war that was the Cold War did in fact end in 1989. But after a hiatus lasting little more than a decade, the United States became engaged in another war without a foreseeable end, this one, the War on Terror. To fight this war, the central government, through the National Security Agency and allied institutions, has arrogated enormous power unto itself. And as the Edward Snowden files reveal, vigilance about civil liberties in the corridors of this national security state has correspondingly and sometimes precipitously eroded. This does not mean that the Bill of Rights has ceased to function as a touchstone of American politics. To the contrary, in certain areas such as gay rights and marriage, it is flourishing as never before. But it does mean that the paradox of state power in the United States, part liberal, part illiberal, endures and will continue to endure across this, the 21st century. Thank you very much.
Thaddeus Blanchette from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. I have two questions for you. Actually, one comment, two questions. First of all, I was listening to your speech and I was thinking of that website that has the flags of all nations written to be what they really are. And the US flag says freedom with a little asterisk, and then it says some conditions may apply. But two questions I have. The first one is, what do you think about Thaddeus Russell's thesis of criminals and outlaws actually protecting America's liberties, given this question of the police power of the states? You talked a lot about the liberal power of the federal government protecting this, but Russell would say that it's actually people defying the state on the ground to a certain degree that also worked to create these liberties that we have, people who would normally be called criminals and outlaws, things like that. And the second question is, could you comment a little bit on the Tea Party mythology of all this? Given that it's quite interesting that they always refer to the Bill of Rights as being the law of the land, but what they really want, it seems, is to move back to the states' rights, period, in many ways. So.
Thank you very much. Second question first, the Tea Party. More broadly, we might ask, what is the understanding of the Bill of Rights in the United States? In terms of what I said today, very dim. So the Tea Party can honestly think that they are harking back to the way America used to be. They are a party of small government, liberal in the classical sense. Part of the confusion about the United States politically is that modern conservatives are the heirs of classical liberalism. Just to confound things, so Tea Party activists call themselves conservatives, but in my telling, they are really classical liberals. If I were to confront them with the fact that many of the Bill of Rights that they cherish were not operative until sometime in the 20th century, quite frankly, they wouldn't believe me. And we'd have to build a conversation from there. We are in a moment of originalism in terms of constitutional interpretation in the United States, which gives a sacredness and a sanctity to the moment of constitution making, and underlying that orientation is the belief that nothing really has changed since then. So the kind of argument that I'm making about a historical Bill of Rights, a Bill of Rights that emerges fitfully, slowly, unevenly against an enormous amount of resistance, can't be understood within that originalist framework. And part of what I hope my work will do is to contribute somewhat to bursting that framework. But it's also true that the left have to understand that these sacred rights have not been there from the beginning. The American Civil Liberties Union and other institutions will talk about the rights that have been with them for more than 200 years now. In fact, those rights have been active in American politics more like 50 or 60. So the history has to be brought out and discussed. In terms of outlaws and criminals defining the boundaries, it's true that many key cases turn on not very pretty people of one sort or another, and it is through the issues that they bring to the fore that the boundaries of what's permissible and what's not permissible get defined. And it's also true that, I think you were implying this, that what is regarded as criminal in one period is regarded as one person's legitimate right in another period. And again, one has to understand this historically, and if I am right, which I think I am, about the slowness of the Bill of Rights to develop and issue its protections, that means that we have to understand particular cases, particular moments, particular struggles where there were efforts to redefine what was legal and what was not. what was permissible behavior and what was criminal. And so these moments in American history take on I would say, an added importance in terms of understanding why some struggles succeeded and why other struggles failed. Thank you.
Boa noite, meu nome é Mariana Joffle, eu vou ter que falar em português. Para começar, porque eu já vou fazer uma ousadia, que é fazer uma pergunta sem ter certeza de ter compreendido completamente a sua proposta. Então, vamos lá. Pelo que eu entendi, quando você faz uma análise de longa duração nos Estados Unidos, você está propondo que, então, de princípio, o governo central era mais liberal no sentido de defender a Bill of Rights e os estados, digamos, alguns estados seriam locus do conservadorismo ou da política não liberal, né? E depois, a partir de um certo momento, com a Guerra Fria, o Estado Central passa a ter, enfim, todo esse aparato militar que o torna também mais autoritário. Então, se é mais ou menos isso, a minha pergunta é, qual que é o foco hoje, então, dessa defesa dos direitos, né? Quer dizer, onde é que parece que tudo se tornou não liberal dentro dessa concepção de defesa de direitos. Então, qual seria o foco hoje no governo dos Estados Unidos, ou na política dos Estados Unidos de defesa de direitos, concretamente?
Thank you very much, and I think you have understood my argument well. And it's a complex argument to try and in one language to be translated into another, but you understood everything. I am arguing that the central government in its origins was a more liberal institution, more bound by the Bill of Rights, and more bound by the principle that individuals have rights in a certain realm of autonomy that no government can touch. What to call the states is a more difficult proposition, because it's not that they were necessarily conservative, they simply were not bound by this liberalism. So some states were actually more radical than the central government. In the 19th century, if you were looking for serious forms of regulation of capitalism, for example, you're going to find the most intense developments at the level of states. You also, at the level of states, find the most conservative and reactionary elements, protection of slavery, protection of hierarchies grounded in sexuality, race, ethnicity, and also a dimension of this, which I didn't get into because this would have added another dimension to the talk, which would have been one dimension too many. States were different from each other, and certain states were regarded as safety valves. So there was always a state where you could go get a divorce. In the 19th century, it was Connecticut. In the 20th century, of course, it's Las Vegas. There were states that welcomed the incorporation of capital without any questions. Delaware and one of my home states of New Jersey. There were certain states that gave women the vote long before they had them in other states. So what one has to factor in here is the diversity of states in the sense that they are in some respects in competition against each other. And some have argued that this police power wasn't really that effective because someone could always pull up from one state and go to another. And if they couldn't drink in New Hampshire, no, if they couldn't drink in Massachusetts, that's wrong. If they couldn't drink in Tennessee, they could go to Kentucky or something of that sort. But what I'm stressing here is that the principles underlying the actions of these states were the states versus the central government were very different, and that the states had a freedom to act on the individual that the central government did not have. It does change profoundly when America enters its period of permanent war, which really begins in 1941, stops for a decade in 1989, and then resumes. And I do not want to suggest that the Bill of Rights, as a result, is a dead letter. I don't want to suggest that it doesn't matter. In terms of the rights of women, in terms of the rights of African Americans, in terms of the rights of gays. Immigrants is a more difficult issue right now. Groups that had felt the very heavy hand of state governments on them in terms of repression now have their rights protected in a profound way that was not the case before the 1960s. And what I'm proposing is not simply that we see America as a militaristic state, which it is. What I want you to struggle with, or this is what, because I'm struggling with it, is how is it that a national security state is the state that finally guarantees the protections of the Bill of Rights? How do we understand that? Because that is, in a sense, one would think the national security state would move in a different direction. But in fact, it is the national security state that enshrines the civil rights revolution into law. And even in this moment, the moment defined by the National Security Agency, this is also the moment when the rights of gays at workplaces to marry, to have a full complement of rights in the United States, has reached a point where I think most people in America on the right and the left thought would not be the case for another 50 years. And that would be another indication and demonstration of how vigorous the discourse of individual rights remains in America and how powerful some of its advances have been. How do we put together the story of gay rights with the story that Edward Snowden and Glenn Greenwald are forcing us to ponder and confront? How do we fit those two stories together? For me, that is the most difficult issue to talk about. And I think also, how do we move away from the older position in the United States, which is that war was temporary, an aberration, you could exceed the Constitution in times of war because it would soon end. Now that the last two wars America has been involved in, one lasted 43 years, the other one will probably last 30 years or more. How does one then begin to rethink the constitutional framework to protect civil liberties in these circumstances utterly unanticipated by the Founding Fathers? Thank you.
Eu não sei se eu também compreendi inteiramente a sua proposição. Eu estou também viajando aqui em algumas coisas e eu fiquei pensando, não é, na possibilidade de pensarmos em diferentes liberalismos nos Estados Unidos e retrocedendo assim ao tempo da oposição, logo após a própria proclamação da República, a Declaração de Independência, e o próprio Jefferson, né, que se dizia talvez não muito otimista, né, em relação ao futuro da nação e a sua preocupação com a questão da virtude relacionada à questão da comunidade. Eu não sei se essa questão da comunidade, do entendimento do que essa comunidade significa, pode ter a ver com isso. Não é? Se, né, esse entendimento um tanto superficial da posição do Jefferson como um defensor, não é, de uma comunidade mais próxima, não é, de uma nação que não crescesse, não é, e que resguardasse a compreensão da virtude como alguma coisa que nascesse, não é? Não do Estado, mas desse consenso comunitário e dessa relação com a natureza, e que de alguma forma foi seguida pelos transcendentalistas, de alguma forma, né? Compreendendo a virtude não como alguma coisa que pudesse ser estabelecida e de alguma forma forjada pelo Estado sobre a sociedade, não é? E eu não sei se eu estou compreendendo bem, mas que essa contraposição entre a União e os Estados possam passar também pela essa compreensão, né, dessa relação orgânica, não é, com uma comunidade imaginada, não é? E o sentido de virtude, de direitos, que se forjam ou se forjariam de acordo com essa comunidade. Você já respondeu um pouco a pergunta do que eu iria fazer em seguida, em relação à questão dos estados que têm diferentes disposições políticas, mais progressistas ou menos progressistas em relação à União. Durante o tempo do Reagan, por exemplo, só para citar um exemplo, não é, que eu tive a oportunidade de olhar um pouco mais devagar, não é, todo o movimento, não é, dos estados, de alguns estados que hoje têm posição muito distinta, mas que naquela altura, nos anos 80, desafiaram o governo central, não é, em favor do movimento de solidariedade América Central, não é? Desafiaram as leis de imigração, desafiaram todo o boicote à venda de produtos à Nicarágua, etc. Né? Numa compreensão também dos direitos do Estado, muito distinta, né, daquele que era proposto pelo governo Reagan. E eu queria perguntar se isso é uma simplificação, certamente, mas se é possível pensar, não é, numa distinção, nessa correlação e nessa oposição ou nessa contradição entre governos federais que a gente possa reconhecer como democratas e liberais e governos republicanos, que a gente poderia qualificar como conservadores de vários matizes, né? Se isso, né, ajuda a estabelecer algumas linhas, ou isso é alguma coisa muito circunstancial, que a sua reflexão hoje assim, seja muito mais geral e que não dê para ser enquadrada dentro desses limites ou configurações mais circunstanciais, né? Então, eu peço desculpas se essa pergunta não é um tanto quanto deslocada, né? Não sei se eu me fiz entender.
Two big questions. One around Jefferson and the other around Reagan and recent developments. I'm not sure I got all of the second question, but let me try and answer both, and then if I haven't, you can ask me again. Historians over the past generation or two historians of the United States have done their best to argue that liberalism was not nearly as strong in the United States as we once thought, because they associated liberalism with individualism, property rights, capitalism, and there was a major effort among historians of the United States to demonstrate that liberalism, individual rights, property ownership, capitalism was not the only thing that got off the boats with the Puritans, that there was a high regard for community as well. And there was a major effort to recover an alternative political philosophy. I was involved in this myself, which we called republicanism, which stressed virtue, community, the welfare of the solidarity, the welfare of the community over individual rights. And there was an effort to argue that this was a big part of American history for a long time until it disappeared sometime in the late 19th and early 20th century. And so America's roots are not just about individualism, but about community, not just about pro-capitalism, but critiques of capitalism. That's where the power of republicanism was. And in my rendering, the states still can be radical critics of capitalism. They can assert the priority of the community and its welfare over the rights of individuals and of corporations. But I think that in the effort to locate a robust anti-capitalist tradition in the United States, there was a rush to embrace this republicanism without thinking of all its implications. Because what does it mean that a community is acting on a sense of its virtue, that it's acting on behalf of the whole community, that people are, of course, if everybody was public interested and had nothing but everyone else's welfare in mind, that would be a wonderful state of affairs in the world. But in fact, these communities tend to be ruled by white men who encode various kinds of notions of community that they have grown up with regarding women, minorities, blacks. And so what I'm suggesting is that there is a coercive side to this republicanism, and if we're to maintain this republicanism as a viable ideology in the United States in the 18th and 19th century, we have to understand this dimension and not treat it simply as peripheral on the sideline, but really as quite central to what it meant to do to constitute community. And many of these states thought of themselves as constituting community, and they thought that the welfare of the community was more important than the rights of particular individuals. And this is where republicanism and liberalism fought things out. So I agree with that fight, but what I'm suggesting in a sense is that republicanism lasted a lot longer than we had thought, and it wasn't always pretty. In fact, it was often very ugly, and we should stop celebrating something that was structured in so hierarchical a manner. So my work connects with that older discussion, but also breaks with it. I think there was an alternative philosophy to liberalism in American history. It could have progressive consequences, but it could also have profoundly regressive consequences. In the South, what did it mean to uphold the rights of the community? It meant to uphold the rights of slave owners against their slaves. And that's true with the first Republican himself, Republican with a small r, Thomas Jefferson, and who was a slave owner, who was the author of the Declaration of Independence, but also a slave owner his entire life. In terms of the late 20th century, the way I might answer it is to say, what does it mean for the central government to vanquish the states? My kind of colorful, maybe purplish language in the lecture. It was late in the lecture, so I needed some colorful language to keep you awake. The states did not go away, and also substantial portions of the population in the United States did not accept the centralization of power in the central government that occurred as a result of the 1960s. The Civil Rights Revolution entailed an enormous concentration of power in the central state, which a lot of people in America did not at the time and still not have accepted. And so they have an ideology of states' rights, of reclaiming for the states what was taken from them. And this became a very important part of the Reagan era, and then it also became an important part of the Democrats and Republicans. It was Bill Clinton, a Democrat, who declared in 1996 that the age of big government was over, even though its actual life was about 20 years or 30 years. And what this reveals is that it reveals something of the transformation of the 1960s and the refusal of very large groups in the United States to accept the kind of centralization of power in the central state that occurred. Usually this critique does not take place in terms of anti-militarism or anti-national security state. It takes place in terms of the other powers the central government has taken onto itself to regulate the environment, to regulate workplace hiring and law, to regulate corporations. And so adding to the complexity of the story, the central government that became so large never acquired the legitimacy it needed to fully support its full range of activities. And so even as it is large and powerful, it is constantly and chronically vulnerable to challenge from the states who say we are the only legitimate institutions in this country who can do this work. So even as America is a leviathan in the world, It is a leviathan standing on feet of clay at home. Its feet are brittle. Its legitimacy is constantly being challenged. A group of Republican conservatives have succeeded largely in paralyzing Congress, so it cannot respond effectively to the challenges the United States faces, building roads, resolving the immigration crisis, a whole host of things. And in this moment of central state paralysis, the states are reemerging with some of their police power to say what the central government can't do, we will. California says, America needs a climate policy, we will provide it for you. A conservative state of Tennessee says, we do not accept Muslims as Americans, we will write laws to prevent that from happening. So there's a way in which what the 60s achieved is in some ways being challenged now. I don't think ultimately it will be successful. I don't think the United States will return to a time when the states were in fact more powerful than the central government. But the struggle has succeeded in paralyzing the central state, and in this moment of paralysis, out of desperation, states are emerging to say, we will try this, we will try that, because we have so many problems that we need to begin to solve. And that is the initiative. That defines a very powerful part of politics in the United States today, which is a way of saying that what happened in the 60s in the transformation is not a settled issue for many Americans, and it's a sign of the magnitude of the transformation of that moment, that these issues are still being fought out. I don't know if that answered your second question, so if it's not, I welcome you to say some more, but thank you.